There were jelly beans on the conference room table. One of the four men kept picking out the red ones, eating them absent-mindedly, while the rest argued about something that, on paper, made almost no sense at all. 28 days earlier, Sony had announced a machine that Microsoft's own executives quietly feared more than any piece of hardware in the company's history. Not because it played games better than anything else on the market, because of what its creators said it would eventually become. Sony had called the PlayStation 2 a platform for the living room, a machine built to outdo Windows itself. A device that, if Sony's own ambitions actually played out, could sit inside hundreds of millions of homes and quietly become the operating system running people's entertainment, their media, eventually maybe even their internet connection. Without a single line of Microsoft code anywhere inside it, 4 engineers in Building 4 on Microsoft's sprawling campus understood exactly what that threat actually meant, faster than almost anyone else in the company. And the solution they eventually walked into Bill Gates' office to propose wasn't a software patch, a marketing campaign, or a licensing deal. It was something Microsoft, a company that had never successfully shipped a single piece of consumer hardware at that kind of scale, had no obvious business attempting at all. They wanted to build a game console from scratch. To go to war with Sony and Nintendo, companies that had spent decades mastering a business Microsoft didn't understand. To understand why 4 relatively junior engineers thought they had any business proposing something this audacious, you have to go back further than that jelly bean. Scattered meeting in March of 1999. You have to go back to 1994, years before any of this took shape, to a secret meeting most of the eventual Xbox team wasn't even present for yet. Kevin Backus, one of the 4 men who would eventually walk into Gates' office, had been personally invited by Sony to that earlier meeting. A small group of people were shown, behind closed doors, the original PlayStation before anyone outside Sony had seen it. Backus remembers it clearly. He thought it was genuinely cool. He remembers other people in the room thinking the same thing, that a company like Sony, historically known for electronics and entertainment rather than computing, was seriously entering the video game business. And in the conversations that inevitably followed, in an industry that loves speculating about who might make the next big move, one name kept coming up, again and again, only to get immediately, reflexively dismissed. Microsoft. Everyone agreed Microsoft would be a natural fit for exactly this kind of ambition. And everyone agreed, just as quickly, that it would never actually happen. That specific contradiction, an obvious fit that everyone assumed was impossible, sat quietly for years, waiting for the right combination of people and pressure to actually test whether the assumption was true. The pieces started coming together almost by accident. Around 1997, Microsoft ran something called a multimedia retreat, an internal gathering that ended up recruiting both Seamus Blackley and Kevin Backus into the company, though neither of them arrived, with anything resembling a console building mandate. Blackley came in as a program manager, initially assigned to a next-generation graphics collaboration between Microsoft and the graphics company SGI, called Fahrenheit. Before Microsoft, Blackley had lived an entirely different kind of professional life. He was a former physicist who'd gone on to work in the video game industry, most notably as the creator of a game called Trespasser, built for Steven Spielberg's DreamWorks game division. Trespasser is remembered today, by most honest accounts, including Blackley's own later reflections, as one of the more spectacular failures in the history of the medium. A dinosaur game that promised revolutionary physics-based gameplay and largely failed to deliver on that promise when it actually shipped. Here's the detail worth sitting with, because it's the kind of quiet irony that tends to get lost in a story told purely as triumph. The man who would go on to help convince Bill Gates to bet real money on an entirely new hardware category had, only a short time earlier, been personally responsible for one of gaming's most visible commercial disappointments. Failure, in this specific story, didn't disqualify him. It's part of what put him in the room in the first place, because during the press tour for Trespasser, Blackley had actually met Gates directly, and Gates had come away genuinely impressed by the technical achievements underneath. The game's commercial failure impressed enough to personally help Blackley land a job at Microsoft in February of 1999. By the time Blackley joined, the Fahrenheit graphics project he'd initially been assigned to was already losing internal momentum, and Otto Burkus, one of the most technically respected engineers inside Microsoft's DirectX group, sensed the same thing Blackley did, that the project wasn't going to succeed, either inside the company or out in the broader market. Burkus needed somewhere to point Blackley's obvious surplus of energy and ideas, so he invited him into an ongoing, entirely unofficial set of conversations he'd been having about Microsoft's broader position in gaming. Around the same time, Ted Hayes, a developer relations specialist working in Microsoft's games group, brought in Kevin Backus, who'd spent what he'd later describe as a couple of genuinely frustrating years promoting a DirectX certification logo program and third-party marketing campaigns. Solid, useful, work, but a long way from the kind of ambitious, category-defining project he'd actually wanted to be part of since sitting in that secret Sony meeting years earlier. And now there were four: Burks, the respected technical mind behind the group's underlying graphics expertise; Hayes, the developer relations specialist who understood exactly how outside game studios actually thought and what frustrated them about working with Microsoft's existing platforms; Bacchus, who'd seen the PlayStation's original ambition firsthand and never quite let go of the idea that Microsoft belonged in this fight; and Blackley, the loudest of the group by every account, a failed game designer turned Microsoft engineer whom Gates himself had personally helped hire. They began meeting informally, mostly in Building 4, one of Microsoft's original campus buildings. What they were actually chasing in those early unofficial conversations wasn't glamorous. Bacchus and Blackley specifically wanted to build something that finally treated game developers with genuine respect, rather than the way Microsoft's platforms had historically operated. Developers having hardware specifications shoved at them from above, rather than being consulted as genuine partners. Bacchus, drawing directly on his own frustrating years inside Microsoft's existing games marketing efforts, pushed the group specifically toward what he called empathy and responsiveness toward the actual people who'd have to build games for whatever they eventually created. Every previous Microsoft attempt at winning over the game industry, in his own assessment, had failed for exactly this reason: a persistent failure to actually listen to the people making the games or the hardware partners who had to build around Microsoft's decisions. Burks, for his part, was chasing something more specifically technical, a version of a personal computer that could be deliberately tailored for gaming, built inexpensively enough to actually compete on price, and simple enough that creating content for it wouldn't carry the same maddening complexity PC game development had always struggled with, thanks to the endless combinations of graphics cards, processors, and configurations any given Windows PC might be running. The specific spark that turned all of this scattered frustration into an actual concrete proposal came to Blackley on an airplane. Flying home from Boston to Seattle, after visiting his girlfriend, Blackley found himself turning over a problem he already understood better than almost anyone at Microsoft: the sheer, maddening number of possible hardware configurations game developers had to account for on any given Windows machine, and the years Microsoft had already spent trying, with only partial success, to standardize around exactly that chaos through DirectX. Somewhere over that flight, an idea clicked into place. What if Microsoft simply removed the variable entirely? What if, instead of trying to standardize an endlessly variable universe of PC hardware, Microsoft built one single fixed piece of hardware itself, its own console, with Microsoft's own name and Microsoft's own market power behind it, tapping into a genuinely enormous pool of hardware manufacturing resources no existing console maker could match? That's the idea Blackley brought back to Burks, Haze, and Bacchus. And the pitch that eventually emerged from their combined thinking was audacious in a way that's genuinely hard to overstate, even now, with the benefit of decades of hindsight. Build a games console. Make it, structurally, essentially, a PC. Hide the operating system entirely, so nobody using it would ever think of it as anything other than a dedicated gaming machine, and call it, for now, the DirectX box, a name that leaned directly into the one piece of Microsoft technology the whole concept was actually built around. Before they ever got near Gates himself, the four engineers first had to convince Ed Fries, the head of Microsoft's internal game publishing business at the time. Fries, according to multiple accounts of this story, was genuinely receptive. He understood the specific threat Sony's PlayStation 2 announcement represented, and he backed the team's idea of building a genuinely Windows and DirectX-based console rather than dismissing it outright. That internal approval mattered enormously, because it meant that by the time this idea finally reached Gates, it wasn't simply four enthusiastic junior engineers pitching a wild fantasy. It had already survived one serious, skeptical internal filter. Their first formally documented meeting as an actual working group happened on March 30th, 1999, precisely 28 days after Sony's PlayStation 2 announcement had first landed in conference room 2095 of Building 5 on Microsoft's Redmond campus. That's where the jelly beans come in, a small, almost absurdly mundane detail that somehow survived in the retelling of this story for decades afterward, Blackley reportedly picking out the red ones, while the group brainstormed specifics, including something as seemingly minor and yet genuinely significant as how to get a PC-based system to boot up as fast as a dedicated console. A technical challenge substantial enough that it eventually became its own dedicated project inside the broader effort. Now picture the actual moment this video's title is really about. Four engineers, one of them a failed game designer Gates himself, had personally helped hire only weeks earlier. None of them senior executives. None of them with any track record of shipping consumer hardware at scale. Walking into a room with Bill Gates, the single most powerful person at the single most dominant software company. on the planet to pitch him on building physical, expensive, high-risk consumer electronics hardware in a market Microsoft had never successfully competed in before, against two companies, Sony and Nintendo, who'd spent decades mastering exactly that business. Gates was not immediately convinced. That's worth sitting with, honestly, rather than smoothing over into an inevitable foregone conclusion story where, of course, Gates said yes because Xbox obviously worked out. In the actual room, in 1999, there was no guarantee of anything. Microsoft's entire business, its entire institutional identity, was built around software, writing code that ran on hardware built by other companies, not building and manufacturing physical consumer electronics itself, with all the entirely different unfamiliar risks that kind of business actually carries: manufacturing costs, supply chains, retail relationships, hardware failure rates, none of which Microsoft's existing organizational muscle was built to handle. But the argument the four engineers were making wasn't really about gaming at all, not fundamentally. It was about survival. Sony's own public framing of the PlayStation 2 wasn't modest. The company was explicitly positioning it as a platform for the living room, a machine built to outdo Windows and Linux both, explicitly signaling ambitions that went well beyond simply selling another generation of game hardware. If that ambition actually succeeded, the living room, an enormous, still largely uncontested piece of domestic technological territory, Almada, could end up running on Sony's terms entirely, with Microsoft holding no meaningful presence there at all. The four engineers were telling Gates, in effect, that the living room was becoming a genuine battlefield, and that Microsoft, for the first time in years, had absolutely no forces stationed on that particular front. That argument was sound enough and urgent enough that Gates eventually approved it. He didn't just greenlight the concept quietly. Either, he became a direct personal advocate for it, helping assemble a broader team that would go on to actually design and build the device, and then personally promoting the resulting console to game developers around the world once it was ready to be shown. When the project was finally unveiled publicly, it wasn't buried in a routine press release. Gates himself revealed it directly, live, in front of roughly 5,000 people during a keynote speech, a level of personal public investment from Microsoft's own co-founder that tells you plainly how seriously the company had come to take an idea that had started as four engineers' unofficial, informal conversations in a shared building on Microsoft's campus. But here's where the story complicates itself, in exactly the way the most honest version of any origin story eventually has to. Not every one of the four original engineers actually stayed for the full journey from that first pitch to an actual shipped product sitting on store shelves. As the project grew, gained real institutional weight inside Microsoft, and inevitably began morphing beyond the specific, scrappy, PC hacked into a console vision the original four had first sketched out together, both Hayes and Burks eventually stepped away from the project, according to multiple retrospective accounts, as its direction shifted further from their own original conception of what it should actually become. That's a genuinely important, often underemphasized part of this story. The Xbox that eventually reached consumers in November of 2001 wasn't a straight, uninterrupted execution of exactly what four engineers dreamed up in Building 4. It passed through Microsoft's enormous, complicated internal machinery, engineering trade-offs, executive oversight, manufacturing realities, marketing decisions, and came out the other side, changed, shaped by far more people and far more institutional pressure than the four original instigators, as they came to be informally known, could have fully controlled or predicted. Backus himself, reflecting years later on his own Xbox experience, said the part he remembered most wasn't any specific technical decision or corporate milestone at all. It was, in his own words, the fantastic team he'd gotten to help build, and the personal relationships and interactions with his three fellow original instigators, more than any individual feature or specification that eventually shipped. It's worth understanding, too, just how genuinely strange the original hardware concept actually was, viewed against what a console had always meant up to that point. Nintendo and Sony had both built their success on dedicated, purpose-built hardware running their own proprietary operating systems. Machines that felt, to consumers, categorically different from a personal computer, even if the underlying engineering shared certain principles. The DirectX box concept deliberately inverted that entire premise. Take a PC, keep it a PC underneath the surface, simply hide that fact from the person actually holding the controller. At a surface level, more than one contemporary account of this decision described the resulting device as essentially a personal computer stuffed into an unusually large box. And unusually large understates it considerably, since the original Xbox console that eventually shipped was genuinely one of the bulkiest, heaviest consoles the industry had seen, a direct physical consequence of trying to fit real PC-grade components into a form factor originally designed around entirely different engineering assumptions. There's a specific detail from Blackley himself, reflecting years later on Twitter, that captures just how genuinely improvised and personality-driven this entire process actually was, right down to some of its most visible design decisions, asked about the original Xbox controller, a notoriously oversized piece of hardware that would eventually earn the nickname the Duke, and that struggled particularly badly in markets like Japan, where the average hand size simply didn't comfortably accommodate its scale. Blackley explained that the team's favorite console at the time was actually Sega's Dreamcast, which itself shipped with an unusually large controller featuring a docking slot for a small, screen-equipped memory device called a VMU, similar in spirit to a Tamagotchi. According to Blackley, that specific detail helped make their own oversized controller design feel, in his own words, less insane by comparison. A genuinely candid admission that at least part of one of the Xbox's most criticized early design choices traced back to 4 engineers taking creative inspiration from a competitor's product they personally admired, rather than purely from careful, exhaustive ergonomic research. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's exactly the kind of human, imperfect, occasionally arbitrary decision-making that tends to get smoothed out of most retellings of major corporate product histories in favor of a cleaner, more deliberate-sounding narrative. The Xbox wasn't willed into existence through some flawless, top-down strategic master plan. It emerged from a specific, particular combination of genuine competitive fear, individual personalities, personal taste, hard-won industry frustration, and, in the case of the controller specifically, at least a little bit of simply liking what a rival company had already built. Now, think about where all of this actually led, because the modern relevance here is genuinely substantial, not a tacked-on afterthought. The console that 4 engineers pitched to Bill Gates in a conference room, built initially as a defensive maneuver specifically against Sony, has grown into something none of its 4 original creators could have fully anticipated sitting in that room in 1999. Xbox today isn't simply a game console competing on hardware specifications against PlayStation and Nintendo. It's evolved into a subscription-first gaming platform with one of the largest content libraries anywhere in the industry, spanning console, PC, and cloud streaming simultaneously. A strategic identity that looks less like a single hardware product these days and more like the very kind of platform-level, living room-transcending ambition Sony itself had originally signaled with the PlayStation 2. The exact ambition that had frightened Microsoft into building a console in the first place. There's a genuine, almost circular irony sitting at the center of that outcome worth naming plainly. Microsoft built Xbox specifically to prevent Sony from becoming the dominant platform sitting inside people's living rooms, controlling access to entertainment and software on Microsoft's own turf. Decades later, Xbox itself has evolved into something considerably closer to a platform than a piece of dedicated gaming hardware, available everywhere, on nearly anything, precisely the kind of boundary-dissolving ambition the 4 original engineers had once found so alarming when Sony first signaled it. The defensive weapon eventually grew into something resembling the very threat it was originally built to counter. So think back to that conference room one more time. 4 relatively junior Microsoft engineers, one of them a failed game designer the company's own co-founder had personally helped hire only weeks earlier, picking red jelly beans out of a shared bowl while arguing about how to challenge 2 of the most successful hardware companies in the entire history of consumer electronics. No guarantee of success, no established track record backing their ambition. Just a specific urgent fear about what an empty living room might eventually cost Microsoft, and just enough conviction to walk that fear directly into Bill Gates' office and ask him to bet real money on it. He said yes, and a defensive gamble born from genuine institutional anxiety about a rival's ambition eventually grew into one of Microsoft's most enduring, most transformed consumer businesses. Proof, if this particular story proves anything, that some of the most consequential decisions in technology history don't begin with a confident, fully formed master plan at all. They begin with a handful of people who are simply genuinely afraid of losing a fight nobody had even asked them to start. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories behind the technology that shaped our world, subscribe to Hidden Historian. There's another story waiting to be uncovered.